A bottle of Kikkoman on the table of a Brooklyn restaurant has a 1,000-year story behind it. The brown, salty, deeply savory liquid in that bottle is the latest version of a Chinese fermentation craft that crossed to Japan with Buddhist monks in the 12th century, was reorganized by Edo period merchant cooperatives into something close to its modern form, and was already on European tables via the Dutch East India Company before Bach was writing the Brandenburg Concertos. Soy sauce is one of the most successfully exported foods in world history. The story of how it got there is also, almost incidentally, a history of East Asian cuisine. The Chinese ancestor. The original is a class of fermented pastes the Chinese called jiang. The earliest written references appear in the Zhou Li, a ritual text compiled in the 3rd century BCE, which already describes multiple varieties, some made from fermented meat, some from fish, some from grains and beans. The shared technology is microbial. Grains or beans are inoculated with a mold, typically Aspergillus oryzae or close relatives, salted heavily, and left to ferment for months or years. The mold's enzymes break down proteins into amino acids, including glutamic acid. The same molecule Ikeda kikunai would isolate from kombu 21 centuries later. The bean-based versions of jiang gradually displaced the meat versions, partly because Buddhist dietary influence in China during the Han and Tang eras pushed away from animal-based foods. By the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, bean jiang, what we would now call a primitive miso or soy paste, was widespread across China. The pressed liquid that ran off this paste during fermentation was the prototype of soy sauce. It was at this stage simply a byproduct. Crossing to Japan. The transmission to Japan happened in stages. Soybean cultivation had reached Japan by the Yayoi period, around 300 BCE, but the fermented bean paste technology arrived later, carried by Buddhist monks returning from study in China during the Nara and Heian periods, 8th–12th centuries. Japanese miso, the soybean and grain fermented paste, is the direct descendant of Chinese jiang, refined for Japanese palates and climates over centuries. The crucial Japanese contribution was the deliberate use of the pressed liquid. The traditional account credits the Zen monk Kakushin, who studied in China in the 13th century and returned to Yuasa, a coastal town in Wakayama Prefecture, with the technique for making kinzanji miso, a chunky moromi-style fermented paste. The liquid that pooled at the bottom of the kinzanji miso vats turned out, isolated and refined, to be remarkable. Salty, deeply savory, with an aromatic complexity that no individual ingredient possessed. The town of Yuasa is now generally recognized as the birthplace of Japanese soy sauce. This was the late Kamakura period, roughly 1250 to 1300. From Yuasa, the technique spread, and by the early Edo period, the 1600s, proto-shoyu was being made across Japan. Noda, choshi, and the standardization of shoyu Edo period Japan turned soy sauce from a regional craft into a national industry. The shogunate's capital at Edo, modern Tokyo, needed enormous quantities of food, and the two towns that ended up supplying most of it, Noda in Chiba Prefecture and Choshi at the mouth of the Tone River, sat at convenient water transport distances from Edo. Both towns had the right ingredients: locally grown soybeans, wheat from the Kanto Plain, salt from coastal pans, and pure river water. The Noda merchant families, Mogi, Takanashi, and others, consolidated their operations over the 17th and 18th centuries, eventually forming a producers' cooperative that in 1917 became Kikkoman. The Choshi families, Yamasa, Higeta, followed a similar trajectory and remain major producers today. By the late Edo period, Noda alone was producing roughly half of all soy sauce in Japan. The distinctive Kanto-style koikuchi shoyu, dark, robust, soy and wheat balanced, became through this commercial centralization the default Japanese soy sauce. Other regional varieties survived. Kansai developed usukuchi, light-colored, saltier, less wheat-roasted, for the pale aesthetic of Kyoto cuisine. The Chubu region, Aichi, Mie, Gifu, developed tamari, almost pure soybean, very dark, viscous, no wheat, which paired with the local hacho miso tradition. Saishikomi, twice brewed using existing soy sauce instead of brine, and shiro, white, mostly wheat, make up the five-style system still taught today. The Dutch shipment. Here is the part of the story that surprises modern readers. By the late 17th century, Japanese soy sauce was already a global commodity. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, which maintained a single permitted trading post in Nagasaki throughout the Edo period, shipped Japanese soy sauce to Europe and Indonesia from at least the 1640s. The 17th century Dutch food writer Cornelis Lakerveld mentioned it. European royal kitchens, Versailles included, used it in haute cuisine sauces during the 17th and 18th centuries. The English word soy derives from the Dutch soja, ultimately from Japanese shoyu. This means that by the time most Europeans had any direct experience of Japan, which would have to wait for Commodore Perry's expedition of 1853, Japanese soy sauce had been on European tables for 200 years. The product traveled faster than the culture it came from. The modern global condiment. 20th century mass production transformed soy sauce again. Kikkoman opened its first American factory in Walworth, Wisconsin in 1973, a direct response to the post-war rise of Japanese cooking abroad and the growing American interest in Asian flavors. Today, Kikkoman alone produces roughly a third of the world's brewed soy sauce. Chinese light and dark soy sauces, shengchou and laochou, Indonesian sweet ketchup manis, a Dutch-influenced variant with palm sugar, Korean Jang family sauces, Vietnamese shidao, all are descendants or cousins of the Chinese Jang tradition, each adapted to local cuisines. A non-trivial fraction of contemporary commercial soy sauce is not actually brewed. Soy protein broken down with hydrochloric acid in hours, rather than fermented over months. The traditional brewed product, with its mold enzyme-driven flavor complexity, remains noticeably better, and is what good restaurants and careful home cooks use. The difference is the same one as between brewed and instant coffee. The cheap version performs the same role, the slow version performs it more honestly. What 1,000 years bought. Soy sauce is one of the few foods we use daily that connects us, directly, by an unbroken thread of practice, to a fermentation craft over 2,000 years old. Each bottle is a downstream concentration of choices. Which beans? Which grains? Which mold strains? How long? How dark? How salty? Chinese, Japanese, global continuity made it possible for a Brooklyn kitchen to use a condiment whose grandparents are Buddhist monastery pots in Wakayama and Han Dynasty bean paste in Hubei. When we splash it onto white rice, we are doing what a 12th century Zen monk in Yuasa did. The vocabulary is the same, only the bottling has changed.